All right, what's up guys? My name is Evan Holmes, and today we're gonna be talking about the best exercises to build some massive triceps. Building big triceps is extremely important because the triceps actually make up more of the arm than the biceps. So if you want big arms, which you do because everybody needs big arms, you have to build big meat slabs for triceps. Fun fact, you don't actually have to have a personality if you have big arms, so pretty easy trade-off there. So the triceps actually have two functions. The main function obviously being extending the elbow, but they also help to pull the arm down, the long head specifically, when it's far enough overhead. There are three main heads of the triceps: the medial head, the lateral head, and the long head. And maybe I'll get Josh to throw a little diagram of the triceps up there so you guys can visualize a little bit better. The long head is the biggest of the three heads, and it crosses both the elbow and the shoulder, and that's why the triceps can contribute a little bit to pulling the arm down. The lateral and the medial head only cross the elbow, they don't cross the shoulder. Because the long head crosses the elbow and the shoulder, it lengthens as the shoulder moves forward or upward, and it shortens as the elbow extends, which means when we're pressing, we're lengthening it at the shoulder and shortening it at the elbow, which means the relative length of the long head doesn't really change that much. So pressing is not going to train the long head. This means that if we want to train the long head, which we do because it's the biggest of the three heads, we want to isolate elbow extension while the shoulder stays relatively still. As an aside, there's a possibility that dips will train the long head quite well as well. We just don't have any data on that to be conclusive one way or the other. So just to keep things simple, to train the long head, you have to train elbow extension while the shoulder stays in relatively one place. The medial and lateral head will be trained anytime you're loading elbow extension, which includes presses, which means the medial and lateral head will get some good amount of work from like shoulder and chest pressing. Because of this, I like to prioritize the long head with all of my, or most of my triceps isolation training, because the medial and lateral head will be trained well anytime the long head's being trained well, but the long head is not always going to be trained well anytime the medial and lateral head are being trained well. Now, based on the data, the long head is actually trained best with the arm by your side, or like maybe slightly out in front, but not overhead like a lot of people think. This is because the long head actually loses leverage to extend the elbow the more that it lengthens around the shoulder, which happens the more that your arm comes overhead. A lot of people think that the long head is actually trained better in the overhead position because it stretches it, and it does stretch it because, like I said, the long head does cross the shoulder, but there's actually only one study that showed better growth for the long head when it was trained in the overhead position, but it also showed better growth for the medial and lateral head in that overhead position, and they don't stretch when the arm is overhead. So clearly the stretch was not the differentiating factor there, and the authors of the study themselves couldn't explain the results. So with that being said, the first exercise on today's list is the cross-body triceps extension. So with this exercise, we want to make sure that our arm is by our side, held slightly away from the body so that the cable is lined up with our arm. So you can do this exercise bilaterally if you have like a dual cable station and you would just do both arms at the same side at the same time. But I like to do it single arm just so I can use the other arm to kind of brace, and that way pushing the cable doesn't, or extending the cable doesn't push me in the opposite direction. So it look like this. So I like to pull the shoulder blades back a little bit, not too far, but just a little bit for some additional stability at the shoulder, and then you can play around with flaring or flexing your lat for some additional stability too. So another thing too is that we want to make sure the cable is almost coming completely across our body rather than toward us a little bit, and that's for two reasons. The first being that we want the peak resistance to be before or at 90 degrees of elbow flexion, because the medial and lateral head gain leverage to lock the elbow out the closer we get to lockout, and we're trying to bias the long head here. That's also going to be easier to stabilize if we have the cable running sideways rather than kind of toward us. And then if we have it coming toward us, it's also going to load shoulder extension a little bit too, which we just don't want to have to worry about while we're trying to train the triceps. So you want it to look more like this rather than this, if that makes sense. So with all that being said, keep your chest up, lock your shoulders down, keep them relatively stable, make sure your upper arm's not moving too much. I like to kind of lean against the stack if I can a little bit, and like I said earlier, just kind of put my hand somewhere here to oppose that resistance, and then lock that elbow out. All right, so next exercise we have up is the Smith JM press, but before we get into that, just a quick little shameless plug for my sponsor, Transparent Labs. If you guys like the videos that I make and you learn from them, feel free to support me. Just use code EVAN at checkout when you order anything from Transparent Labs. I partner with them just because they make science-based supplements. You know, they're really stringent on standardization, sourcing, the ingredients they use, the dosages and stuff. So little product highlight for today is the creatine HMB. It tastes delicious because they have a bunch of really good flavors, so that obviously kind of incentivizes you to actually take your creatine, which you should. And before I get asked, take your creatine. You can take it bulking, cutting, male, female, anything in between, old, young, whatever. And you should just take 5 grams every single day. And then the little HMB that's included in this is actually going to help prevent muscle breakdown. There are actually a couple studies out comparing creatine by itself to creatine with HMB, and the creatine with HMB resulted in better lean body mass gains. So JM press is basically using the Smith machine to isolate elbow extension. It's kind of like a completely tricep dominant press, or you can kind of think of it as like if a skull crusher and close grip bench had a baby. So the JM press will likely bias the medial and lateral heads a little bit more than the long head, but I still really like this exercise. And as long as we keep our elbows held forward and our upper arm from moving backward and forward too much, it's still gonna train the long head quite well. I like this movement because it's very loadable, it's very stable, and it's just fun. Like, you get a nasty tricep pump from this movement. You can add a band to make lockout harder if you want to bias the medial and lateral heads more as well. So as far as setup and execution, you want to bring your shoulder blades slightly depressed, not retracted, just slightly depressed to keep them a little bit more stable. You want to have your hands roughly shoulder width. And like I said earlier, you want to keep your elbows held forward and lower the bar slowly to right around where your eyes are. Obviously, where you lower the bar to is going to be different, slightly different depending on the individual, because we're not all built the same. But the idea is loading elbow extension while keeping the arms, the upper arms, in relatively one place. So you want to make sure you're lowering it very slow and controlled, just so you're not bouncing off your elbow tendons, because your elbows might get pissed off with you after a while doing that. And if you're prone to elbow issues, because this loads elbow extension so much, I would just start with lighter weight, higher reps, and not train all the way to failure at first, and just kind of work your way up to training closer to failure using heavier weight and lower reps. So as you can see with this Smith machine, it goes, as the bar goes upward, it moves gradually that way. And we want to face that same way so that when we're extending the bar, we're not doing this and it's moving slightly, kind of almost downward, right? Whereas if we were facing the other way, we'd be loading shoulder flexion, and we don't want to do that when we're trying to train the triceps. Now, like I said earlier, because the lateral and medial heads get trained well anytime we're loading elbow extension, I like to prioritize movements that train the long head the best. So because we're training elbow extension with our arms by our sides, this is a similar movement to the crossbody extension, so I wouldn't do these in the same session, but this movement also checks off a lot of those important boxes that we're looking for with our triceps training. Those boxes being that it's very stable, very loadable, and it trains the long head well, and it's just a different variation that some people may like more. It's also bilateral, so if you're short on time. Now, you might think it's a little over the top to set a bench up to do a triceps pushdown, and you would be right if you're a beginner, intermediate, but as you get stronger with pushdowns, some of you may have noticed this already, it starts to become a bit of a core movement because you have to keep your core, your torso stabilized so that you're not pushing yourself away. And I'm noticing this when I do my tricep extension movements, pushdowns, it starts to become a full body movement because I have to keep everything so rigid and stable, my abs specifically, to just perform a tricep pushdown that's heavy enough to challenge my triceps. The bench just eliminates that limitation and allows you to just focus purely on effort, which is good because that means more motor unit recruitment. So generally speaking, we want the bench set to an incline that's roughly parallel with the cable, and that's just so that we're able to keep our arms roughly by our sides and we're not loading shoulder extension, which would be this movement. We don't want to be training the lats here, we're training the triceps. And we'd be loading shoulder extension if the bench was too reclined. So generally speaking, same angle as the cable is going to be while you're doing the movement. So I would either use a long rope attachment, which this is sort of that kind of thing, just to allow some freedom of movement. Or you can use like a cambered or straight bar. The long rope attachment is probably going to be a little bit more joint friendly, but if the cambered or straight bar is not bothering your joints, then give her. As far as cues go, very similar to the crossbody extension. You want to have, your chest not necessarily proud, but you don't want to be too caved. Arms by your side, and you can pull your shoulder blades back and depress them a little bit. Maybe even flare your lats a little bit as well, just for some additional stability at the shoulder. And then just lock those elbows out. So as an honorable mention, we've got a couple movements that I think would be honorable mentions. The katana extension. Now you might be like, Evan, what are you doing training overhead extension? That's not good for long head. I just think it's a good idea to have variation in. So just because I don't think that the long head is trained the best in an overhead position, doesn't mean I'm anti-overhead position. So for some variation, I do program katanas. I've made great progress with them myself. I program them for my clients and for the sake of variation, but also because it's a good movement to improve your shoulder mobility because you have to stabilize the shoulder and you're loading it in that overhead position. So there's kind of like an added benefit there. So just briefly from a setup and execution standpoint, I like to have my arm in the scapular plane, so not too far out to the side and not pointing directly forward. I just find I have better control and it's more comfortable there for me, and most people will probably find that as well. And then I just like to make sure that I'm kind of driving my elbow upward at least a little bit so that it's not moving around a lot while I'm doing it. That will help with the mobility aspect, like I mentioned, and it will just ensure that we're isolating tricep extension, we're isolating elbow extension. So it's gonna look something like this. The next exercise is going to be the internally rotated skull crusher. So that's going to be set up like this, where the cable's coming behind my opposite shoulder. I just like this movement because it adds some variation. We don't usually load elbow extension in an internally rotated position like this, so it's going to add some variation from that. And it's a stable movement because I am pushing this way, so I'm pushing myself backward. But if I'm leaning against the machine, then I'm not going to be able to go anywhere. So then I just take the opposite arm here and kind of brace my upper arm on this side. And it's going to look like that. The next movement is just going to be a standing cable single arm skull crusher. And I just like this movement because super accessible. Lots of gyms have standing cable station, and it's very stable because, again, my back is against the machine. And I just like to do these movements with a cable rather than a dumbbell because in this instance, the cable is going to be a little bit more stable than a dumbbell. So it's just a skull crusher. I'm going to use my opposite arm to, again, brace my upper arm here. And we're just loading elbow extension. Both this skull crusher and the internally rotated one will work all heads of the triceps. Not the long head quite as well, but because of the fact that our upper arm is not overhead all the way and it's not moving forward and backward, the long head will still get some stimulus with those as well. So the last movement is a free weight alternative for anybody who doesn't necessarily have access to cables. Those people are probably not still watching the video, but hey, I tried. This is called a rolling dumbbell skull crusher, or rolling dumbbell tricep extension. Basically what it's doing is combining elbow extension with shoulder extension, which I spoke about earlier. The triceps long head actually does function to kind of extend the humerus when it's overhead, and this movement kind of just loads both of those movement patterns or those functions. And so it's just a traditional skull crusher, but you're gonna let your arms kind of go overhead a little bit at the bottom, and that's gonna load that shoulder extension component of the long head a little bit too. And that's the reason that I like this movement more than other free weight alternatives, just because other free weight alternatives kind of don't have that added little benefit, and it makes this movement a little bit more fun, adds a little variation. So if I had to pick a free weight movement just for that reason, without thinking about it too hard or knowing any other context, I'd probably pick these. All right, guys, that's the video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something. There are lots of other tricep exercises that I would also call good and worth doing. These are just the ones that I think are the best based on the data, biomechanics, and real world application with myself, my clients, and obviously lots of other people have been doing these movements for a long time. Feel free to comment and or like the video if you feel so inclined. You know, sub the channel if you haven't already. All of that supports me and I really, really appreciate it. If you'd like to support me in another way, like I said earlier, use my code at either YoungLA or Transparent Labs, get a discount as well. And if you're interested in coaching or anything in that regard, then just check out the links in the description of this video. And I'll see you guys in the next one.